A human mechanic repaired the dragon baby's broken toys for free, not knowing they were royal heirs. The smell of burnt wire and machine oil had lived in that shop so long it had become part of the walls. Darrow did not notice it anymore. He noticed the crack in the third shelf that he kept meaning to fix. He noticed the way the overhead light flickered when the ventilation fan kicked on. He noticed the small things because small things, in his experience, were the ones that mattered. His shop sat at the far end of Dock Row, where the pavement turned uneven, and the signs above the doors were too faded to read from a distance. Other species ran food stalls and parts traders along the strip. Darrow ran the only repair shop that would take anything ship components, household tools, children's toys, broken clocks, cracked lenses. If it had moving parts and it had stopped moving, Darrow would look at it. He was not rich. He was not well connected. He had stayed on this trade world after the Galactic Contact era opened the borders because the work was steady and the district needed someone who knew how to fix things without overcharging. That was enough reason for him. It was a gray afternoon when the two dragonlings walked through his open door. They were small knee-height on Darrow, which meant they were very young by dragon standards. Their scales were a deep greenish-brown, the color of old river stones. Their eyes were gold, wide, and calm in a way that most young creatures were not. They were dirty in the way that children who had been playing outside all day were dirty, dust on the claws, a smear of something blue near one nostril. Each of them was holding something. The taller one held a wind-up starship model. It was a beautiful thing, even broken, painted in silver and deep blue, with tiny engine nacelles and a rotating bridge dome. The dome was no longer rotating. The gear that turned it had snapped clean through. The smaller one held a music box. It was round and brass-colored, with little stars etched into the lid. When the smaller dragonling turned the key on the side, it made 2.5 notes and then stopped, stuck somewhere in the middle of a song it could not finish. Darrow put down the coupler housing he had been working on. He looked at the two dragonlings. They looked at him. The taller one stepped forward and held out the starship model with both front claws, the way a child holds something precious that they are trusting you with. Darrow took it carefully. He turned it over, opened the small panel on the underside, and looked at the gear with a magnifier. Clean brake. Replaceable. He had a parts drawer full of tiny gears from old clockwork toys and models. One of them would fit. He looked up at the dragonlings. "I can fix this," he said. He pointed at the music box. "That one too. Give me a little time." The taller one, he would later learn her name was Sorai, sat down on the floor of the shop without being invited and watched him with those wide gold eyes. The smaller one, Breck, stayed standing and began looking slowly around the shop at all the things on the shelves, hands clasped behind his back, not touching anything, just looking. Darrow worked. He found the matching gear in the fourth drawer. It took him 20 minutes to fit it, reset the spring tension, and test the dome rotation. It turned smoothly all the way around. He set the model down in front of Sarai. She picked it up and turned it in her claws. The dome spun. She made a sound low in her throat, not words, just something warm. The music box took a little longer. The problem was a bent pin on the cylinder that dragged against the comb and stopped the rotation. Darrow used a fine-point tool to straighten it by fractions, testing after each adjustment until the cylinder turned freely. He wound the key. The music box played its full song. Breck turned around from the shelf he had been studying. His ears, small, ridge-like, pressed flat back, came forward. The music was a simple tune, repeating and soft, the kind written for children to fall asleep to. Breck listened to the whole thing without moving. When it ended, he walked over to Darrow and pushed a coin across the work table. It was a small coin, unfamiliar currency, probably worth very little. Darrow pushed it back. Breck tilted his head. He pushed it forward again. Darrow shook his head. "No charge," he said. He mimed fixing the toys and then held both hands open, empty, free. Breck stared at the open hands for a moment. Then he looked at Sarai. Some kind of communication passed between them that Darrow could not read, no words, just a shift in how they held themselves. Sarai stood up, tucked the starship model under one arm and walked out the door. Breck picked up the music box, paused at the doorway and looked back at Darrow once. Then he followed his sister. Darrow watched them go. He picked up the coin Breck had left behind. He had slipped it onto the table after all, quiet as a pickpocket in reverse, and set it on the shelf above his workstation next to an old bolt he kept for no reason except that it had been his father's. He went back to the Coupler housing. Across the street, pressed into the shadow between a food stall and a cargo lifter, a figure in a dark travel cloak let out a breath that had been held for a very long time. She was tall, gray-scaled, and her eyes had not left the two small shapes since they had turned down Dock Row 40 minutes ago. Her hand was still resting on the handle of something under her cloak. She watched the dragonlings emerge from the shop. She watched them walk together down the street, calm and unhurried, Sarai spinning the dome on her model as she went. Vora did not move for another full minute. Then she followed, staying in the shadows, and did not look back at the repair shop or the human inside it. Not yet. A human mechanic repaired the dragon baby's broken toys for free, not knowing they were royal heirs. 3 days passed before they came back. Darrow was under the belly of a small cargo hauler when he heard the familiar soft scrape of small claws on the shop floor. He rolled out from under the hauler, wiped his hands, and found Sarai and Breck standing in the middle of the room with a small pile of broken objects, arranged carefully on his work table, as if they had been planning this visit. A cracked telescope lens with a hairline fracture across the lower quarter. A tiny automaton bird, copper wings, a clockwork chest, missing its left wing entirely, the joint snapped off. A glowing cube about the size of a fist, edges soft with light, with a latch on one side that no longer caught. Darrow looked at the pile. He looked at the dragonlings. They looked back at him, patient and expectant, the way children look at someone they have already decided they can trust. He put on his magnifiers and got to work. The telescope lens was the trickiest. A full replacement would have been the easiest solution, but he did not have a matching lens in stock. Instead, he used an optical bonding compound, a thin, clear resin he kept for exactly this kind of fine fracture, and applied it in a single careful pass along the crack with a needle-fine applicator. It would take an hour to cure. He set it under a low UV lamp and moved on. The automaton bird was more interesting. The wing had not just snapped, the mount inside the joint had sheared, which meant whatever force had broken it had been sudden. He fashioned a new internal mount from a piece of thin alloy rod, shaped the end to fit the socket, and reattached the wing. Then he tested the flap mechanism. Both wings beat in slow, alternating strokes. The bird was not elegant when it moved, a little stiff, a little deliberate, but it moved. Breck watched the whole repair with his chin resting on the edge of the work table, so close that Darrow had to ask him once, gently, to move back so the tools had room. Breck moved back exactly 1 claw length. Darrow did not push the point. The glowing cube turned out to be simple. The latch pin had simply slipped its groove. 30 seconds of work with a small pick, a soft click, and the lid opened cleanly. The cube pulsed once with a stronger light when the latch caught, as if it approved. Sarai made a sound when she saw that, short and bright, almost like a laugh. When all 3 repairs were done and laid out on the work table, Breck reached into a small pouch hanging from his neck and produced 2 coins. He set them down with deliberate care, side by side, and looked at Darrow with an expression that said clearly that this time the coins were staying. Darrow looked at the coins. He looked at Breck. He picked up 1 coin and handed it back. "1 is too much," he said, keeping his voice even and friendly. "Nothing is the right price, but if it makes you feel better," he pointed at the remaining coin, then made a small gesture as if placing it on an invisible shelf, then 1. "Fine." Breck considered this for a long moment. Then he put the second coin back in his pouch with the gravity of someone accepting terms in a formal negotiation. After that, it became a pattern. They came every few days. Sometimes they brought broken things. Sometimes they brought nothing and simply sat Sarai near the small welding station, where she would watch the blue-white sparks drift and die with something close to meditation on her face, and Breck by the shelves, studying each object with slow, serious attention. Darrow started talking to them while he worked, not expecting responses, just filling the quiet the way he always had in an empty shop, narrating the job, explaining what he was doing and why. He did not notice for several days that Breck had started handing him tools. Not randomly, correctly. Darrow would reach toward the tool rack and Breck would already have the right tool in his claw, held out handle first, watching Darrow's hands to see which one was needed. He never spoke. He never got it wrong after the first week. Darrow taught them a few words. He held up a wrench and said the word slowly. Sarai repeated it, not quite right, the consonants softened by a mouth shaped for different sounds but close. He said careful when Breck leaned too close to a hot component. Within 2 days, Breck was saying it back to him when Darrow was working fast on something delicate, a quiet, slightly accented reminder. In return, they taught him 2 words. The word in their language that meant friend, which was low and rounded and took him a week to stop mispronouncing, and the word that meant warm in the way that had nothing to do with temperature, the warmth of a place you were glad to be in. He used the second word wrong once, and they both went very still for a moment, and then Sarai corrected him gently, and they moved on. On the 15th day of their visits, Breck fell asleep. It happened without ceremony. He had been sitting on a folded tarp in the corner while Darrow worked a long repair, and at some point the slow sounds of tools and the low hum of the shop had been enough. When Darrow looked over, Breck was curled on his side with both hands tucked under his chin, scales rising and falling slowly. Darrow turned down the overhead light. He took his spare work jacket from the hook by the door and draped it over the small, sleeping shape. Then he turned back to his work and kept his movements quiet. Outside, in the narrow dark between the cargo lifter and the food stall, Vora stood completely still. She had been watching every visit. She had the training and the patience for this kind of work. She did not react to small things. But the jacket, that small, wordless, automatic thing, made something in her chest do something she had not been prepared for. She stood there for a long time after Darrow turned back to his work, watching the light in the window and the still shape under the jacket, and the human who had already gone back to fixing something else. A human mechanic repaired the dragon baby's broken toys for free, not knowing they were royal heirs. The Vreth came on a Tuesday, which was not special except that Darrow had been having a good day before they arrived. He had fixed a pressurized coolant line, reunited a Cellori family with a water purifier that had been broken for 2 months, and found, in the bottom of a parts bin, the exact micro-relay he had been looking for since the previous month. The sun, this world's sun, slightly more orange than Darrow's home sun but warm enough, had been coming through the shop's front window at a low angle and making everything look better than it probably was. Then the Vreth arrived and the day changed. There were 4 of them. The Vreth were a stocky species, broad-shouldered and flat-faced, with eyes that sat very far apart and a way of moving that took up more space than their bodies strictly required. The one in front had a yellow stripe on his collar that meant something in their hierarchy, enough stripe to be in charge, not enough stripe to be someone important. He told Darrow about the fee, the protection fee, monthly, automatic, non-negotiable. It was the same thing he had told the noodle seller 2 doors down and the Pelori parts trader across the street. Both of them had paid. This was how things worked in the district now, apparently. Darrow told him no. He said it in a flat, calm, polite voice, not aggressive, not scared, just no. The Vreth with the yellow stripes stared at him with those wide-set eyes for a moment as if recalibrating. Then he told Darrow to think about it, and they left. They came back the next morning with 2 more. Sorai and Breck were already in the shop. Sorai was sitting by the welding station. The flame was off, but she liked the stool. Breck was next to the work table, watching Darrow do a calibration job on a guidance chip. Neither of them had looked up when the Vreth walked in. The lead Vreth did not bother with conversation this time. He lifted one of the tools from the wall rack and threw it through the front window. Glass came down in long pieces onto the pavement outside. One of the other Vreth started pulling items off the display shelf by the door. Darrow stood up. He moved in front of Sorai and Breck, not rushing, just stepping into the space between the dragonlings and the Vreth with the same unhurried manner he used when he reached for a tool he used every day. He stood with his arms slightly out from his sides, not raised, not fists, just present, a wall that had decided to be there. "Those are children," he said. His voice was the same flat, calm voice as before. "You can talk to me about your fee, but they're going to stay right where they are, and you're going to stop throwing my things." The lead Vreth looked at the 2 dragonlings behind the human. He made a calculation behind those far-apart eyes. The dragonlings were small. They were young. They were, for the Vreth's purposes, irrelevant. He took a step toward Darrow. "I'd stop." The voice came from the doorway. Vora did not come into the shop. She stood at the threshold with her travel cloak pushed back off her shoulders, both hands visible at her sides, and looked at the lead Vreth with an expression that was not angry and was not afraid, and was somehow worse than both. She said 3 words in the Vreth trade language, short, clean, each one precise. Darrow did not speak Vreth trade language. He could not have told anyone later what she said. But he watched the lead Vreth's face go through several changes very quickly. Confusion, then recognition, then something that was not quite fear but was fear's older, more serious cousin. The Vreth left. All 6 of them. The one who had been pulling things off the shelf set the items down before he went, which Darrow found notable. The shop was quiet. Wind moved through the broken window. Darrow looked at Vora. Vora looked at Darrow. "Friend of yours," he said. She said nothing for a moment. Then, "Pick up your things." She looked at Sorai and Breck and said something in their language, short and firm. They stood up without argument and came to her. Darrow watched her take each dragonling by the hand and walk out. He stood in the quiet shop for a moment. Then he found his broom, swept the broken glass onto the pavement, and taped a piece of pressure board over the window frame. He would get proper glass cut tomorrow. Tonight he would see if Mara, the Pelori trader down the block, wanted to share the repair cost. She had a broken window too, from 2 weeks ago, still boarded. He thought about the look on the lead Vreth's face after those 3 words. He was not a man who scared easily. He had lived in this district for 11 years. He knew what fear looked like on many different faces. What he had seen on the Vreth's face was not the fear of a threat. It was the fear of a name. The fear of discovering, too late, that you had walked into a room that was much larger than the door suggested. He filed this away. He went back to the guidance chip. That night, Vora stood on the roof of the transit hostel 3 buildings down and composed a coded message in her head before sending it. She kept it short. She said the human mechanic had placed himself between the heirs and 6 armed Vreth enforcers. She said he had not drawn a weapon because he did not carry one. She said he had not called for help, had not run, had not asked the heirs to run either. She said he had simply stood there. She sent the message. She looked at the boarded window in Darrow's shop for another minute. The light inside was still on. He was still working. She went inside. A human mechanic repaired the dragon baby's broken toys for free, not knowing they were royal heirs. The city had been different for 4 days before Darrow noticed. He noticed things late when they were outside his shop. Inside, he noticed everything. Outside. The district was just texture. The same stalls, the same faces, the same particular hum of a place that never fully went to sleep. So it took him 4 days to register that there were new faces at the entrance to Dock Row, and that they stood in a way that security personnel stood when they were trying not to look like security personnel, and were not entirely succeeding. He mentioned it to Mara at the parts counter next door. She told him there was a Dragon Embassy transit ship at berth 7, something diplomatic. She was not interested in the details. She wanted to know if he had found a compatible condenser coil for her shop heater. Darrow said he had ordered one. He went back to his shop. Sorai and Breck arrived an hour later. He noticed the difference before he understood it. They were cleaner, not just washed-dressed. Small formal wraps around their shoulders in deep green fabric edged in gold thread. Their scales had been oiled until they had a faint shine, and there was something on their necks, marks, or perhaps they had always been there, but now they were visible, not hidden under dust and ordinary days. Small symmetrical lines pressed into the scales, geometric and deliberate, the kind of pattern that was not accidental. They came in quietly. Sorai was carrying something small in one closed claw. Breck had a piece of flat material under one arm. He had pressed on it with a claw until there were shapes. A drawing of sorts, rough and simple and clearly made with effort. They put both things on the work table. Sorai opened her claw. Inside was a carved token, a flat disc of some pale stone with a design on each side. The carving was old and extremely fine. It was not a toy. It was not something a child had found in the dirt. Breck unrolled the flat material. He had drawn scratched, really, with a claw 3 figures side by side. 2 small dragon shapes and one taller, thinner shape that was clearly meant to be a human. They were standing close together. Under the drawing, in scratched marks that Darrow recognized as very simplified versions of the dragon script he had seen on shipping manifests, there was a single word he could not read. He looked at both things on the table. He looked at the dragonlings. "These are goodbye gifts," he said. It was not a question. Sorai looked at him steadily. She did not deny it. Darrow nodded slowly. He picked up the drawing and pinned it to the wall above his work table, between the bolt that had been his father's and a photograph of the district from 10 years ago. Then he picked up the carved token and looked at it carefully and set it on the shelf where he kept things that mattered. He was going to say something ordinary and enough, the way he usually ended things when Vora came through the door. And with her came 2 others. He had seen many species in 11 years on this world. The 2 who came in behind Vora were dragons full-grown, formally dressed in layered robes of deep red and gray, wearing shoulder pieces that caught the light. They were not large the way a threat was large. They were large the way very old trees were large, the size of something that had been important for a long time. They looked at Darrow. One of them spoke, their language first, then after a breath in trade common, careful and accented but clear. "You are the mechanic, Darrow." "Yes," Darrow said. "You have, on multiple occasions over recent weeks, provided shelter, labor, and protection to 2 individuals. Free of charge, without request, and without knowledge of their standing." Darrow glanced at Sorai and Breck. Breck had gone very still in that way he had. Sorai was watching Darrow's face. "I fixed their toys," Darrow said, "and I didn't move when some people with bad manners came to make trouble." The official paused as if deciding whether to address the simplicity of that or move forward. He moved forward. He said it plainly. The dragonlings before Darrow were the first and second heirs of the dragon sovereign throne. They had left the royal transit ship during the stopover 3 weeks ago without authorization. They had not been found immediately. They had found their own way, as heirs sometimes did in old stories, by instinct, by accident, or by something that could not be fully explained. Darrow sat down on his stool. He looked at Sorai. She looked back. She spun the dome of her repaired starship model once slowly with one claw. It turned smoothly. She had been carrying it with her. He looked at Breck. Breck made the small gesture, a fractional tilt of the head that Darrow had learned over weeks meant something like, well, yes, that is how things are. So all this time, Darrow said, mostly to himself, I've been letting royalty hand me wrenches and sleep on my rag pile. The formal official made a sound he was clearly not prepared to make. Vora, standing to the side, looked at the window. The second official reached into a flat case he was carrying. He produced a folded document, actual paper, which was unusual, pressed with a seal Darrow did not recognize. He set it on the work table with both hands, the way important things were set down. Under Dragon Royal law, he explained, there was an ancient designation, given to any non-dragon who freely, without payment, without knowledge of rank, sheltered or protected a member of the royal line. The designation had no land attached to it, no money, no political weight. It was purely formal, 300 years old and almost never granted. It was called Warden of the Line. The document said that Darrow was now one. Darrow looked at the document. He looked at the seal. He looked at the two heirs who were watching him with their wide gold eyes. I just, he said slowly, fixed some toys. Breck leaned forward and patted Darrow's hand once with his claw, gently, as if this were very simple and Darrow would understand it soon. A human mechanic repaired the dragon baby's broken toys for free, not knowing they were royal heirs. The ceremony took place in the lower hall of the Dragon Embassy, on a day when the orange sun came through the tall windows at an angle that made everything look like it was happening inside Old Amber. Darrow borrowed a shirt from his neighbor, Pell, a Selori translator who was roughly his height and had better clothes. The shirt was a dark blue, fitted, made from fabric that did not wrinkle. Darrow wore his own boots because Pell's feet were shaped differently. He arrived at the embassy gates and gave his name to the attendant, who checked a list and waved him through without ceremony. The hallway inside was tall and cooler than outside. Everything in the embassy was scaled for beings larger than Darrow, which meant the doorways felt generous, and the furniture made him feel faintly like a child visiting an adult's house. There were other dragons in the hall, not many. None of them were the two formal officials from the shop. These were quieter figures, older probably, though Darrow was not expert at reading Dragon Age. They stood near the walls and watched him cross the room with the careful, neutral attention of people who were paid to notice things. Vora met him at the inner door. She was not in the travel cloak today. She wore something formal and dark, with a high collar and the same geometric scale marking visible at her throat. She looked like a different person, and exactly the same person. You came alone, she said. Who would I bring? Darrow said. She did not have an answer for that. She held the door open. The inner hall was smaller than he expected. No crowd, no audience. A low platform with an inlaid design on the floor, geometric, the same style as the marks he had seen on Sorai and Breck's necks. On the far side of the room stood the dragon sovereign. He had been told she was old. What that meant for a dragon, he had not fully understood until he was in the same room as her. She was the largest dragon he had ever seen, which was notable because the dragons on this world were not small. Her scales had shifted from whatever color they had once been to a deep dark gray with an undertone like dull iron. Her eyes were gold, the same gold as Sorai and Breck's, but with more weight in them, more distance. She was alone except for one attendant. Darrow walked to the middle of the room and stood there. He was not sure what gesture was appropriate. He settled on standing straight and not doing anything wrong by accident. The sovereign looked at him for a long time without speaking, long enough that it would have been uncomfortable if Darrow had been the kind of person easily made uncomfortable by silence. He waited. Then she asked him, in trade common that was nearly unaccented, the first time they came to your shop, why did you fix the toys? It was not phrased quite like a question. It came out like something she had been carrying for a while and was setting down to look at. Darrow thought about it. The honest answer was simple, and he saw no reason to make it more complicated. They looked like they missed their toys, he said. Broken things that used to work, that's a simple kind of sad. I can fix simple. The sovereign was quiet. The attendant beside her was very still. I have received diplomats from 14 species, the sovereign said finally. Trade partners, treaty negotiators, military liaisons, cultural envoys. In 300 years of rule, not one of them gave my children anything without a reason attached to it. Not one of them spent time with Sarai or Breck that was not calculated. A pause. You gave them 6 weeks of your time and asked for nothing. They were good company, Darrow said. The sovereign made a sound, not a word, something below a word, something old. Yes, she said, they would be. The ceremony itself was short. The document was read aloud in 2 languages. Darrow was given a second copy pressed with the seal, his to keep, and a small metal object that served as a physical marker of the title, a flat piece of dark alloy with the same geometric design as the floor. It fit in his palm. He was told the title carried no obligation, commanded no authority, and required nothing of him. He said that sounded about right. Sarai and Breck appeared from a door beside the platform. They had clearly been waiting for this part. Sarai immediately took her position to his left and Breck to his right, which was apparently not in the formal program because Vora closed her eyes briefly with the expression of someone too experienced to react. The sovereign looked at her children, flanking the human mechanic. Something moved across her face, not a formal expression, something quieter and less controlled than that. After the ceremony, when the attendant had withdrawn and the hall was nearly empty, she stopped Darrow before he reached the door. There is something else, she said. She did not frame it as a command. She was careful about that. She said that what she was describing was a voluntary role, informal, requiring nothing he was not already doing. She said she had watched the district reports. She knew about his dinners, the neighbors who came to the shop, the way different species had started gathering in that small room of broken things and repairs without anyone organizing them to do so. She said she was not looking for an ambassador. She had ambassadors. They wore good clothes and said careful things and changed very little. She was looking for someone who fixed what was actually broken. She wanted to know if Darrow would be willing to serve, in his own way, as a bridge point between the sovereignty and the human settlements in this sector. Darrow thought about this. He looked at the metal marker in his hand. He looked at Sarai, who was slowly spinning the starship dome. My shop stays where it is, he said. Of course, the sovereign said. I'm not moving to a cleaner district or a bigger building. We would not ask you to. And I'm going to keep fixing things for free when I feel like it, regardless of whatever title you've given me. The sovereign looked at him with those ancient gold eyes. Warden, she said simply, that is precisely why we chose you. Vora walked Darrow to the gate. They did not speak most of the way. At the gate he stopped and turned. Can I ask you something? He said. She waited. That first day, when they walked into my shop, how long were they in there before you found them? Vora looked at him. Something moved behind her eyes. 47 minutes, she said, which is 47 minutes more than should have been possible. Darrow nodded slowly. He looked down at the metal marker in his hand. They're good at getting where they want to be, he said. Yes, Vora said, they are. He walked home. A human mechanic repaired the dragon baby's broken toys for free, not knowing they were royal heirs. 6 months after the ceremony, Darrow's shop looked almost exactly the same as it always had. The front window was real glass now instead of pressure board. There was a second work table along the back wall, a sturdy one that Pell had helped him move in, which was now usually covered in whatever Breck had been working on during the last visit. The drawing, 2 small dragon shapes and 1 taller human shape, was still pinned above the first work table, slightly faded at the edges from the sun that came through the window in the late afternoon. The carved token Saurai had given him sat on the shelf next to his father's bolt, and the coin Breck had left that first day. Darrow had not moved to a bigger building. He had not moved to a cleaner district. He had accepted a small monthly sum from the Dragon Embassy, described in the paperwork as a cultural liaison stipend, and he had spent most of it on parts for the neighbors and on fixing the cracked pavement in front of Mara's shop, which the city authorities had been promising to repair for 3 years. His role as a bridge point, the sovereign's word, not his, was not what he had expected, mostly because he still was not entirely sure what he was doing. There were no meetings to attend. There were no titles to speak under. What there was, practically, was this. Once every 2 weeks, Darrow hosted a dinner at the shop. He cleared the work tables, put boards across them, and covered them in whatever food was easy to make in large quantities. People came. Dragon Embassy staff who were told it was unofficial and came anyway, off-duty and quieter than they were in the embassy. Human dockworkers from the row, Mara and her family, the Celori family whose water purifier he had fixed. Sometimes a Pelori trade official who had initially come to complain about something, and then stayed for the food, and then started coming back, because the dinners were the only place in the city where someone from the embassy would talk to him like a person instead of a petition. Nothing was decided at these dinners. No treaties were discussed. No formal language was used. What happened was that beings who had been in the same city for years without being in the same room finally ended up in the same room, and after a few visits the room stopped feeling unfamiliar. Vora came to most of the dinners. She sat at the end of the table and drank the tea that Darrow made from a blend a Pelori trader had given him, which was strong and slightly bitter, and she claimed was tolerable. She spoke when she wanted to speak and was quiet when she did not, and over time she had become part of the specific furniture of the shop in the way that a stool that had always been in the corner eventually became impossible to imagine the room without. Saurai and Breck came when their schedule allowed. They were growing fast. Breck was already up to Darrow's shoulder, which was still short for a dragon his age, but he was gaining. He had started learning human tool mechanics in a formal sense, taking a course through the embassy's educational program, and when he came to the shop now, he brought questions that were harder than before. He asked about load tolerances and material fatigue, and why human mechanics tended to over-engineer joints while under-engineering mounts, which was a genuinely good question that took Darrow a full dinner to answer properly. Saurai had started collecting things. Not broken things made things. Small metal objects that Darrow taught her to make from scrap, folded shapes, fitted pieces, simple mechanisms that did one thing well. She kept them in a leather case she had gotten somewhere and took the case everywhere with her now. The embassy staff called this her Dock Quarter collection, with an affection that had started as gentle and become genuine. A Galactic news service ran a piece about Darrow. It was a short piece, not a major story, a human mechanic in a port district who had become a cross-species liaison by fixing children's toys. The headline was mildly clever. The piece was picked up and passed around in certain circles, mostly human ones, and the responses were almost uniformly the same. A short laugh, a particular kind of warmth, a recognition of something that felt right in a way that was hard to explain. The dragons who read it found the human responses puzzling. Vora explained, when asked, that humans often communicated important things through laughter. This was not considered satisfying as an explanation. She said it was the best explanation available. Darrow did not read the piece. Pell read it and told him about it. Darrow said that was fine and went back to what he was working on. On the afternoon of the last day of those 6 months, when the orange sun was doing its lay-tangle thing with the light, a new figure came through the shop door. It was small. Darrow could not immediately place the species, something with fine pale fur and very large dark eyes, bipedal, the height of a young child. It was holding something against its chest with both arms. When it got close enough to the light, Darrow could see what it was holding. A toy, round, with legs. Several of the legs were bent and one was missing entirely. It had probably once made a sound because there was a speaker membrane on its side, but the membrane had a hole in it now. The small creature stopped in the middle of the shop and looked at Darrow. Darrow looked back. He had no idea who this child was. He had no idea what their species called themselves, or what language they used, or where they had come from, or whether they were the heir to anything at all. He pulled his stool over, sat down so he was closer to the child's eye level, and held out both hands. "Give me 10 minutes," he said. The child set the toy in his hands. It stepped back and watched. Darrow turned the toy over in his hands and began to look for what was wrong. He did not ask who they were. He never did. The galaxy ran on diplomats and treaties and carefully worded agreements between species who were still learning to trust each other. It ran on military alliances and trade negotiations, and the slow, difficult machinery of formal contact. All of that was real and all of it mattered. But somewhere in the middle of it, in a shop at the end of Dock Row where the pavement was slightly uneven, and the light came through the window at an angle that made everything look better than it probably was, a human with grease on his hands was fixing something small. And asking for nothing. And that, quietly and without any announcement, was also how it worked.